The knock came at 7:30 on a Tuesday evening in the autumn of 1882, and Patrick Maddox was already on his feet and crossing the room before the sound had fully registered in his mind, before his body had consulted the part of him that had spent 6 years making certain no one ever knocked on that door at all. He stopped himself 2 steps from the threshold, his hand hovering near the latch, and stared at the door as though it had grown teeth. The lantern on the shelf behind him threw a warm orange light across the rough-hewn boards of his front room, catching the dust motes that drifted in the still air, and for a moment the only sounds were the distant complaint of cattle somewhere along the eastern pasture and the dry scratch of wind through the cottonwood at the corner of the house. Then the knock came again, 3 firm, unhurried raps, and Patrick pressed his jaw tight and opened the door. The woman standing on his porch had red dust from the road on the hem of her dark traveling skirt, a carpetbag hanging from one hand, and the kind of expression on her face that belonged to someone who had been traveling too long and resting too little, but who was not going to let either of those things show more than they already had. She was perhaps 27 or 28, dark-haired, with steady brown eyes that took in Patrick and the lit room behind him, and the fact that he had clearly not expected to see a living soul on his porch, with the same calm that a woman who had crossed half of New Mexico territory in a hired stage with a broken spring tended to develop. "I beg your pardon," she said. "I was told at the trading post in Seco Flats that a Patrick Maddox kept a ranch on this road and that he sometimes let a room. My name is Esther Fletcher. I have come from Santa Fe. The stage broke an axle 2 miles south, and I would very much appreciate shelter for the night." Patrick looked at her for a long moment. He looked past her at the empty road, at the violet bruise of the sky where the sun had just given up its last fight, at the dust still settling in the ruts. He looked at the carpetbag, and at the way she was holding herself very still in the manner of someone who had already decided that if he said no, she would simply turn around and find another way because there always was another way. "I don't let rooms," he said. "I was told you did not, strictly speaking," Esther said, without missing a beat. "I was told you were private and unlikely to be welcoming. I was also told that you were the only dwelling within reasonable walking distance, and that the alternative was sleeping beside a broken stage in country that has had Comanchero activity reported within the month." Patrick looked at her again. The wind moved through the cottonwood. "Come in," he said, and stepped back from the door. He could not afterward have told anyone exactly why. He had said no to the circuit preacher, said no to the traveling patent medicine salesman, said no twice to the young deputy from the county seat who had ridden out with questions about cattle in the southern draw that Patrick did not own and had not seen. He had said no so many times, and in so many ways that the habit of it had become something close to architecture, a wall as real as the adobe one that faced the road. But Esther Fletcher knocked and he moved, and only when she was already inside and he was closing the door behind her did the part of his mind that kept the wall in good repair catch up with the rest of him and begin to ask what exactly he thought he was doing. What he was doing, he told himself, was being a decent human being, nothing more complicated than that. The interior of the Maddox ranch house was clean in the way that a single man who disliked clutter and had no one to make clutter for kept a space clean, which meant orderly and spare and not particularly warm. There was a table with 2 chairs, a shelf with a few books and a lamp, a cast iron stove against the north wall with a covered pot sitting on it that smelled of beans and salt pork, and a door at the back that led to the sleeping room. A second, smaller room off the kitchen had at various earlier points in the house's history served as a pantry, and then briefly as a place where Patrick stored a saddle and 3 coils of rope that he had since moved to the barn. It contained, at present, a narrow cot that he sometimes used when his back troubled him and a wooden chair. He showed Esther Fletcher the small room. He showed her where the water basin was. He put an extra lamp in there and said that supper was beans and that she was welcome to them, and she said thank you in a voice that meant it, set her carpetbag down on the cot, and sat in the wooden chair to remove her boots. And Patrick went back to the main room and stood at the stove looking at the pot and trying to understand what had just happened to the architecture of his solitude. They ate at the table, which was unavoidable given that there was only the one table, and Patrick discovered within the first few minutes that Esther Fletcher was not the kind of person who sat in polite silence. She was not loud about it. She was not the kind of woman who talked to fill space. But she asked questions with a directness that Patrick found he did not know how to deflect without being actively rude, and since he did not actually want to be rude, he answered them. And then he found to his considerable surprise that he was asking questions back. She had been a school teacher in Santa Fe for 4 years. Before that she had lived in St. Louis, where she had been born, but her father had died, and her mother's sister had gone west and Esther had followed, as people did. She was going to Tierra Amarilla in the north of the territory, where a school had advertised for a teacher, and where she had been offered the position on the strength of her letter of recommendation, and the fact that qualified teachers were not easy to come by in the northern settlements. "What made you leave Santa Fe?" Patrick asked. He was scraping the bottom of his bowl, and he said it without quite looking at her. "A man," Esther said, without any particular shade of bitterness or regret, just the plain fact of it. Or rather, the absence of the man I thought I was going to marry, and the continued presence of the man he turned out to be. Santa Fe is a small enough city that those two things have a way of overlapping considerably. Patrick looked up at that. There was something in her voice that was not quite sorrow and not quite humor but occupied the same territory as both, and he recognized it the way you recognized a country you had lived in a long time ago. "I understand that," he said. She looked at him across the table. The lantern between them made the shadows move. "I expect you might," she said. "This is a very quiet house for a man who is not that old." He was 31. He did not tell her that. "I like the quiet," he said. "Most people who say that," Esther said, thoughtfully, not cruelly, "mean that they chose the quiet because something noisier stopped being available. That is not the same as liking it." Patrick put his spoon down. He looked at this woman who had been in his house for slightly under an hour, and who had just said the most accurate thing anyone had said to him in 6 years, and he felt something shift in his chest the way ice shifts when a river starts to move again in spring, that deep, reluctant groan of something that has been still too long beginning to contemplate motion. "I'll heat more water for the basin," he said, and stood up. He did not sleep well. He lay in the dark of his bedroom listening to the quiet sounds of another person in his house, the small creak of the cot in the other room, the sound of the wind finding the gap under the eave that he had been meaning to seal since August, and he thought about things he had become practiced at not thinking about. He thought about Clara, which was what he always did when he let his guard drop, and he made himself do it the way you make yourself look at a wound to see if it has healed, with the same combination of necessity and reluctance. Clara, who had married him in the spring of 1876 at the age of 24, who had laughed at things that other women did not find funny, who had loved this land with a fervor that Patrick had matched, who had died of a fever in the October of that same year, 7 months after the wedding, before the house was even properly finished. 6 years. He had not let anyone pass that door in 6 years, had made himself into something that required no other people, had built the ranch into something good and solid and self-sufficient, because a ranch did not leave. A ranch did not die of a fever. A ranch simply asked for work and gave work back, and that exchange had seemed for a long time like all he needed or deserved. Esther Fletcher knocked and he found himself moving before he decided to, and now he was lying awake thinking about Clara and about brown eyes, and about the way someone could say a true thing so quietly that it arrived without defense. In the morning, he made coffee. Esther came out of the small room with her hair already pinned, which told him she had been awake a while, and she said the coffee smelled wonderful, which was gracious of her given that Patrick's coffee was functional rather than wonderful, and she sat down at the table and wrapped both hands around the cup and looked out the window at the early light coming across the grass. "The stage company will send someone from Seco Flats this morning," she said. "They have a man there who does repairs. I would expect a replacement rig by midday." "You could wait here," Patrick said. He said it the way you say something you have not planned to say, quickly, before the planning part of your mind can intervene. Esther turned to look at him. "That is kind," she said. "I have to ride the south fence line this morning," he said, looking at his coffee. "There has been wire cut twice in the last month. You would be welcome to the house while I'm out." "Wire cut," Esther said. "Trouble with neighbors." Patrick was quiet for a moment. "Trouble with a man named Harlan Cree, who runs cattle on the parcel to the southwest, and who has been trying to acquire this land since before I got here. I bought it ahead of him, apparently, and he has not forgiven the territory for allowing that to happen." Esther's expression shifted subtly. "Is he dangerous?" "He is the kind of man," Patrick said carefully, "who does things through intermediaries and paper and cutters and never himself, because he is smart enough to know that doing them himself would create consequences he cannot manage. So dangerous in the way that slow water is dangerous. Not dramatic, but it gets where it means to go." "I see," Esther said. She was quiet for a moment. "Do you have help on the ranch?" "I have a man who comes 3 days a week. Domingo. He is good with horses and reliable. He will not be here today." Patrick rode out at 7, and he spent the next 2 hours on the south line finding the third cut section of wire in as many weeks, which meant it was escalating, and he repaired what he could with the roll of wire he carried on the saddle, and made a mental note to ride into Seco Flats within the next few days to file a formal complaint with the county land office, which he had been putting off because it required him to go to Seco Flats and be in a room with people. He thought about Harlan Cree and the unhurried malice of the man, and he thought about the conversation at breakfast, and he thought, without meaning to, about the way Esther Fletcher had looked out the window at the morning grass as though she was actually seeing it, not just waiting for the midday stage. He got back to the ranch at 10:15 to find that the stage company had not yet sent anyone, which did not surprise him given the state of the road and the efficiency of operations in Seco Flats, and that Esther had found the broom and swept the front room and was sitting on the porch steps with a book open on her knee. She looked up when he rode in, and she shaded her eyes with her hand against the morning light, and she said, "No stage yet." And he said, "I see that." And she said, "I made more coffee. I hope that was acceptable." And he said, "More than acceptable." And he unsaddled the horse and put him up and stood in the barn for a moment with his hands on the stall rail before going back across the yard. He took his coffee on the porch because she was there, which was not a thing he did, and they sat in the 2 wooden chairs that faced the road and talked about the land in the way that 2 people who both love a landscape talk when they have just discovered they share that feeling. Esther told him about the mountains above Santa Fe and the quality of the light there in winter, and Patrick told her about the way this particular piece of ground looked after rain, the color of the grass, the way the air changed. He had not talked about the land to anyone in so long that the talking of it felt strange, and also, in a way he could not have articulated, necessary, as though the land had needed to be spoken aloud. The stage company's man arrived at 11:45 in a mule cart with a replacement axle, and the news that the repaired stage could be in Seco Flats by early afternoon, and that Miss Fletcher could continue north in the morning if she wished to wait over at Seco Flats, or she could wait for the northbound stage which came through on Thursdays. It was Tuesday. Patrick looked at the mule cart, and then at Esther Fletcher, and then at the road. "There is no reason you should put yourself to the expense and inconvenience of 2 nights in Seco Flats," he said, in a voice that was very careful. "The stage does not come through until Thursday, and the hotel in Seco Flats is not a good hotel. You are welcome to stay here until Thursday morning if you choose. The stage company's man said nothing, but Patrick could feel the man's awareness of the conversation and ignored it entirely. Esther looked at Patrick for a moment with those steady brown eyes. She looked at the ranch house and the barn and the big cottonwood and the far line of mountains going blue in the midday haze, and she said, "I do not want to impose." "You are not imposing," Patrick said. "I offered." She said yes. The stage company's man left. Patrick found himself standing in the yard with the sun at the top of its arc, and a woman who was going to be in his house for 2 more days, and a feeling in his chest that was either trouble or something he had forgotten the name of, and possibly both. Wednesday they rode out together, which happened because Esther mentioned at breakfast that she had not been on a horse since leaving Santa Fe, and Patrick had 2 horses, and the south pasture was worth seeing at this time of year. And the words came out of his mouth before the careful part of him could intervene again, and he had stopped arguing with that pattern enough to just let it proceed. He saddled the mare, who was gentle and steady, for Esther, and he watched her mount with the confidence of someone who knew what she was doing, and they rode south through the dry grass with the morning cool still clinging to the low places, and the sky above them the particular hard blue that belonged to New Mexico in October. They did not talk constantly. That was the thing Patrick noticed. Esther was comfortable with silence in a way that did not feel like withdrawal, the way his silence was, but rather like ease, like someone who did not need to fill every moment but was happy to be in it. They rode along the ridge above the south pasture, and she stopped her horse at the edge and looked out at the long drop of the land toward the distant river and said, simply, "Oh," and that single syllable held something that Patrick recognized as the right response, the only response, and he felt the ice shift again in his chest. "It is something," he agreed. "How long have you been here?" she asked. 7 years, he said. "I came in 1875. She did not ask why he had come or why he had stayed, and he did not volunteer it, but there was a quality to the silence after that answered something without either of them speaking. They ate lunch at the ridge, sitting in the grass with the horses tied to a post cedar nearby, eating the biscuits Patrick had wrapped in a cloth that morning, and Esther told him about the school in Tierra Amarilla, what she knew of it, a small building, 40 students of varying ages, several of whom spoke primarily Spanish, which suited her because she had learned considerable Spanish in Santa Fe. She talked about teaching with a kind of restrained warmth that told Patrick it was not just employment for her, but something she genuinely believed was worth doing, and he listened to her talk about children learning to read with the same attention he gave to things he cared about. "Why teaching?" he asked. She thought about it genuinely, which he appreciated. "Because my own education changed what was possible for me," she said. "I was the daughter of a dry goods merchant in St. Louis, and there were not supposed to be very many options for what I became. But I had a teacher who treated knowledge as though it were the most valuable thing in the world and who gave it away freely, and I thought if I could do that for someone else, that would be a worthwhile use of a life." She paused. "Also, I am considerably better at teaching than I am at most other things, and I believe one should do what one is actually good at." "That is very practical for such an idealistic statement," Patrick said. Esther laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh fully, and it was not delicate or careful but real, and it landed somewhere in the middle of his chest and stayed there. "I am generally both," she said. "It is sometimes inconvenient." On the ride back, they passed near the southwest corner of Patrick's land, close enough that Esther could see the place where the fence had been cut and repaired. "This is where it was?" she asked, looking at the newer wire. "Third time," he said. She studied the fence line and then looked west toward where the Cree operation lay beyond the ridge. "You said you are filing a complaint with the land office." "I have been meaning to." "You should do it soon," she said. "If this man Cree is escalating paper matters, it establishes a record." "I know," Patrick said. He looked at the fence and then at her. "You sound as though you have dealt with something like this before." "My aunt had a claim dispute in Taos," Esther said. "She let it go on too long without documentation, and it cost her. The law in the territory is imperfect, but it is not useless. And Cree sounds like the kind of man who counts on other people's reluctance to engage with it. Patrick said nothing, but he filed away every word she said and knew she was right, and that the real reason he had not ridden to Seco Flats was not the inconvenience of people, but the knowledge that filing the complaint would make the situation real in a way that would require him to be engaged with the world. And engagement with the world was something he had spent 6 years learning to ration. That evening after supper, Patrick lit the lamp on the shelf and took one of his books down and sat in his chair and expected Esther to go to the small room because that was what he would have done. But instead she took the other chair and opened her own book from her carpetbag, and they sat across from each other and read. And the room was warm from the stove, and the lamp sent their shadows up the wall, and outside the wind was easy in the cottonwood. And Patrick held his book open and looked at the same page for a considerable time without reading a single word. He looked at her instead. Not constantly, not in a way that anyone could have objected to, but in the way that you look at something new that has appeared in a familiar landscape, with that combination of curiosity and uncertainty that comes from not knowing yet if the new thing changes everything or nothing. She was absorbed in her book, her face tilted down, one strand of dark hair having escaped its pin and falling beside her cheek, and she was entirely self-contained and entirely present, and Patrick thought with a clarity that startled him that he had not felt another person's presence in this room like this since Clara, that the house had been empty in every way that mattered, and he had told himself the emptiness was peace. She looked up and found him looking. He did not look away. He was not sure he could have. "What are you thinking?" she asked. It was a direct question, and she asked it directly without coyness. "I am thinking," Patrick said slowly, "that this house has been very quiet for a long time, and that I had forgotten that quiet and warmth are not the same thing." Esther held his gaze for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "I had forgotten that too, somewhat." Neither of them said anything else, and after a while they went back to their books, but the room felt different, fuller, the way a room feels when something important has been said and not taken back. He did not sleep well again, but for entirely different reasons than the night before. Thursday came in clear and cold with frost on the grass. Patrick was up before light, as he always was, and he built up the stove and put the coffee on and stood at the window and watched the darkness lift over the eastern hills with the particular attention he gave to things he knew were ending. Esther would take the northbound stage. She was going to Tierra Amarilla to teach children how to read and to do something worthwhile with her life, and that was exactly what she should do, and he was going to watch the stage go north and come back to his quiet house, and that was exactly what he was going to do. He turned away from the window and found her in the doorway of the small room, already dressed, her carpetbag beside her. "Coffee is ready," he said. "Good morning," she said. They drank coffee in the early dark, and the stove crackled, and outside the first pale line of light was beginning above the mountains, and Patrick thought he should say something. He thought there were things worth saying, and that the particular skill of his recent years had been the avoidance of exactly those things, and that avoidance was a kind of answer but not the one he wanted to give this morning. "Esther," he said. She looked at him. "I would like to know," he said very carefully, "if you would be willing to write letters to this address, if you are willing." She put her coffee cup down. She studied his face with those steady eyes that missed nothing. "I am willing," she said. "I would like that." "I am not easy correspondence," he said, because he believed in being truthful. "I am out of practice with most kinds of communication." "Patrick," she said, and the sound of his first name in her voice was something he had to breathe through. "I am going to a settlement in the northern mountains to teach school in winter, and I will be very glad of letters from anyone who means what they write." "Most people do not mean what they write." "I would mean it," he said. "I know," she said. "That is why I said yes." The northbound stage came through at 9:30, and Patrick helped Esther Fletcher put her carpetbag up, and she took hold of the stage's door frame, and then stopped and turned and looked at him standing in the road with the morning sun behind him and his hat in his hands, which he had removed without thinking, and she said, "Thank you, Patrick, for the door. Thank you for knocking," he said. She smiled at him then, a full and unguarded smile, and got into the stage, and the driver snapped the reins, and Patrick stood in the road until the stage was gone around the bend in the north, and then he went back into the house and stood in the middle of his front room in the warm quiet and felt the absence of her as though something had been rearranged. He wrote the first letter that same evening. It was not a good letter. It was stiff and careful and too short, 4 sentences about the south fence and the coffee, and the fact that the frost had left the grass silver that morning, and that he hoped the journey north had been uneventful. He read it back to himself, and thought it was the sort of letter a man wrote when he had not been in the habit of saying anything true for 6 years, and then he sent it anyway because the alternative was sending nothing, and nothing seemed suddenly like a much worse option than an imperfect something. Her first letter back arrived 11 days later, forwarded through the Seco Flats post office on a Wednesday, and he read it standing in the barn with a brush in one hand because that was where he was when Domingo brought it from town, and he read it twice through and then a third time. She wrote the way she talked, directly and with warmth, and with a particular quality of observation that made ordinary things interesting. She described the road north from Seco Flats, the look of the mountains changing as you climbed, the first sight of the Tierra Amarilla settlement, small and earnest against the pines. She described the school building, which was exactly as small as advertised, with a single window and a stove that drew poorly and 41 students who ranged in age from 6 to 16. And who looked at her on her first day with the careful assessment of children who had had several teachers, and were not yet prepared to trust another one. She ended the letter with, "I think of the ridge above your south pasture. I think that light must be extraordinary in winter. Write to me again, please." Patrick put the letter in the inside pocket of his coat, close to his chest, and went back to brushing the horse, and the warmth in his chest was not ice anymore but something that had been liquid for a little while now and was finding its level. He wrote back that same evening. The second letter was longer than the first. The letters continued through October and into November. Patrick found, as the weeks passed, that writing to Esther was doing something unexpected to him, was forcing him to be present in his own life in a way he had stopped being. He wrote about the ranch, but he found himself writing about it with an attention he had not brought to anything for a long time, noticing the particular quality of the October light she had asked about and describing it, noticing the first snow on the high peaks, and the way the cattle moved differently in cold weather. He wrote about Harlan Cree because she asked, and reported that he had finally ridden to Seco Flats and filed his complaint at the county land office, and that the sheriff, a competent and unruffled man named Asa Trent, had said he would ride out and speak to Cree formally, and that since the formal visit the wire cutting had stopped. She wrote back that she was relieved to hear it, and that she had been thinking about the Cree situation more than was probably warranted given that she had only been at the ranch for 2 days, and it was not her ranch, and Patrick read that and smiled at the letter in a way that would have surprised anyone who knew him. She wrote about the school. She had won over most of the students by the 3rd week, not through leniency, but through the particular approach of treating each of them as though they were already capable of what they had not yet learned, as though the knowledge was already in them waiting to be found, rather than a thing being poured in from outside. She wrote about a boy named Miguel who was 12 and could not read at the beginning of October, and who by the end of November was working his way through a book of natural history that she had brought in her carpetbag from Santa Fe, slowly but with an intensity that she said in her letter made her feel as though everything was worthwhile, all of it. Patrick read that letter 4 times. He also, that November, rode back to Seco Flats on a Wednesday for no reason that he listed in the ledger he kept, which tracked the ranch's needs and expenses, because the reason was that he wanted to post a letter rather than wait for Domingo to take it. And waiting 2 more days had started to feel genuinely intolerable. And that itself was information about his current state of mind that he took out and looked at carefully as he rode, and did not find as alarming as he might have expected. In December, she wrote him a letter that was different from the others, not in what it said, but in what it asked. She said, "Patrick, I hope you will tell me if I am presumptuous, but I feel I have come to know you somewhat through these letters, and I find myself curious about what happened in this house before you became a man who did not open his door. You do not have to tell me, but I ask because I think it matters, whatever it was, and because I think perhaps it would do something good to say it out loud to someone who wants to hear it, and not only to the empty house." He sat with that letter for 3 days before he answered it. Then he wrote 6 pages, which was the longest thing he had written since he had kept a journal in the first year after Clara died, and he told Esther about Clara. He told her about meeting Clara Hensley in Las Cruces in the winter of 1875, about the way she had argued with him in a hardware store about the quality of a particular kind of hinge, and won the argument, and about how that argument had led to a conversation that had lasted 2 hours, and had ended with him asking if he could call on her and her saying yes, direct as anything, yes. He told her about the wedding in the spring, and about bringing Clara to the ranch that was barely a house yet, and about the way she had looked at the land with the same expression Esther had worn looking out across the south pasture, that open, real, full expression. And he told her about the fever in October, quick and cruel and total, and about the 7 months that were all they had, and about the 6 years after. He sent the letter and then walked out to the barn and spent an hour doing things with his hands, because sitting still was not possible. Her answer came 12 days later, which was not quick given the distance, but which felt like an eternity, and it was not full of condolences or carefully phrased sympathy, though there was tenderness in every line. She said, "I am sorry, Patrick. I am sorry she was taken, and I am sorry you have been carrying it alone, and I think you are a braver man than you know for having built something good and real out of the years after, even if those years were quiet. I think she would know that. I hope you believe that." She paused in the letter and then she wrote, "I also want to tell you something, because you were honest with me, and I believe honesty is a kind of gift." The man in Santa Fe was named Thomas Weaver. He was a lawyer and he was charming, and I was 24, and I believed him when he said I was the only one, and he was lying. And when I found out I was neither the first nor the last to be told that by him, I felt not only heartbroken but foolish, and the combination is particularly difficult. So I understand something about closing a door, even if your door and my door were closed for different reasons, and mine was only closed for a year before I opened it again. Patrick read that paragraph and then read the next one, which said, "I am coming south for a visit in January. The school closes for 3 weeks and my aunt in Taos has asked me to stay with her. If Seco Flats is not too far out of the way from Taos, I would very much like to see the ranch in winter if you are willing to receive a guest." He was out of his chair before he had finished reading the sentence. He wrote back that same hour. He said, "Seco Flats is entirely in the direction of Taos. The ranch in winter is worth seeing. The south pasture after snow is the best thing on this land. I will be glad to receive you for as long as you care to stay." January was 3 weeks away, and Patrick Maddox spent those 3 weeks doing things to the ranch house that he had been putting off for several years on the grounds that there was no one to do them for. He repaired the eave where the wind found the gap. He fixed the door to the small room, which had developed a tendency to swing open in the night because the latch plate had worked loose. He bought a decent rug in Seco Flats on his next supply run, and put it on the floor of the front room where the boards were cold, and he bought 2 glass lamp chimneys to replace the ones that had gone smoky, and he found himself standing in the store in Seco Flats, looking at a jar of honey and thinking that Esther had mentioned in one of her letters that she took honey in her coffee when she could get it. and he bought the jar and brought it home and put it on the shelf and stood there looking at it, and was honest enough with himself to acknowledge that he was a man who had been changed by a woman he had known for 2 days and 100 pages of letters, and that the change was not something he was inclined to resist anymore. She arrived on the 14th of January, 1883, on the southbound stage from Taos, coming through Seco Flats at midday, and Patrick had ridden into Seco Flats that morning because the stage from Taos ran through, and he did not want her to have to hire a cart for the road out to the ranch. He stood outside the stage office in the cold with his hat pulled down and his coat buttoned, and he watched the stage come in and watched the door open and watched Esther Fletcher come down the step with her carpetbag, and she saw him immediately, and her face did something warm and undone, and she said, "You came to meet me." "I did," he said. She stood in front of him in the cold January street of Seco Flats and looked at him, and he looked at her, and there were 2 months of letters between them like a bridge, and the bridge was solid, and they were both standing on it. "It is very good to see you," she said. "It is very good to see you," he said, and meant it in a way that the words were not quite adequate for. He had 2 horses, the bay for himself and the mare for Esther, and they rode out to the ranch through the cold midday light with the mountains white to the north, and the grass pale and stiff with old frost. Esther rode beside him, and the silence between them was the same as on the ridge in October, easy and full rather than empty, and Patrick thought that this was what he had forgotten existed, this particular kind of being with someone. The south pasture in winter was as good as he had promised. They rode the ridge in the late afternoon with the low sun throwing long shadows across the snow-patched grass, and the whole world going gold and blue, and Esther stopped her horse at the same place she had stopped in October and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "Patrick." "Yes," he said. She turned and looked at him, and there was something in her face that was not careful at all, that was entirely open. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I want to tell you now out here, because if I wait until we are back at the house, I think I will find a way to be practical about it, and it does not feel like a practical thing." He held very still. The horse's breath made small clouds in the cold air. "I have been writing letters to you for 3 months, Esther said. And I have been, in those 3 months, significantly happier than I was in the year before them. I think about this land and about you in it every day. I think about the honey jar on your shelf, which I know about because you mentioned it in your last letter, and which is possibly the most telling thing anyone has ever said to me about how they feel, because a person who buys honey for someone is a person who is thinking about them in the quiet moments. And I think that I came to Tierra Amarilla to start a new life, but that I did not expect the new life to include a very quiet rancher who opens a door he has kept closed for 6 years and then buys honey." Patrick looked at her in the cold golden light, and the carefully constructed quietness of him was entirely gone. "Esther," he said. "You do not have to say anything," she said quickly. "I only wanted you to know." "I am going to say something," he said. "Give me a moment to find it." She gave him the moment. "I have been in love with this land for 7 years," he said. "Before that I did not know it was possible to love a landscape, that a piece of ground could mean something to a person the way a person does. And when Clara died I thought that was the only kind of love I had left in me, the kind you give to a place because a place cannot leave. But these 3 months I have understood that I was wrong about that the capacity did not die. It was only waiting." Esther looked at him across the small distance between their horses in the January light, and her eyes were very bright. "Is it waiting for me specifically?" she asked, and there was the practical Esther, the direct one, asking the thing directly. "Specifically," he said. She leaned across the distance between their horses, and Patrick met her halfway, and she kissed him once, brief and certain, and pulled back and looked at him. "Good," she said. They rode back to the ranch in the early dark, with the stars beginning to show, and the cold sharp and clean on their faces, and Patrick had the sensation of something very large and very important having been settled, as though the ground beneath him had shifted back to level after years of a slight and persistent tilt, that he had grown so accustomed to he had stopped noticing it as a tilt. The rest of her visit was a week. 7 days that Patrick afterward carried in his memory with a completeness and clarity that ordinary days rarely achieved. They rode every morning. They cooked supper together, which was different from cooking alone in every way, louder and more chaotic and considerably better. They talked for hours at the table and in the chairs by the stove and out on the porch in the cold, bundled in coats, watching the sky for the changes that meant weather. Esther was curious about everything: the ranch, the land, the history of the territory, the Navajo and Apache, and the way the territory's relationships with those nations had been conducted with a brutality and a dishonesty that she named plainly and without romance, which Patrick appreciated because he had felt the same discomfort and had not always heard other people name it directly. "My students include children of several nations," she said one evening, "and I think about what it means to teach them the history that is being written about their own people, written by people who were not there or who were there on the wrong side of it. It troubles me. I try to teach around it as honestly as I can." "That is important," Patrick said. "It is insufficient," Esther said. "But it is what I can do, and I believe doing what you can is better than doing nothing because what you can do is imperfect." Patrick looked at her across the table and thought, not for the first time, that she was the most honest person he had encountered in a considerable number of years, and that honesty in a person was a kind of beauty that outlasted most other kinds. He showed her the repair work he had done on the house over the 3 weeks before her arrival, and she said nothing until she saw the honey jar on the shelf, and then she reached up and took it down and held it in both hands and laughed that real, full laugh, and put it back and said, "Patrick Maddox, you are a man of considerable feeling for someone who gives the impression of very little." "I contain multitudes," he said, which made her laugh again. On the last evening of her visit they sat on the porch in the dark and cold, and Patrick said what he had been building up to all week. "I would like to ask you something, and I want you to know that I understand completely if the answer is no, or if the answer is not yet, or if the answer is a condition." She turned to look at him in the dark. "Tierra Amarilla is 5 hours north," he said. "And I understand that you have a position there and students who are counting on you and a life you have built, and I am not asking you to give that up. I am asking whether, at the end of the school year, you would be willing to come back here. Not to visit, to stay. I am asking if you would marry me." The silence was long enough that his stomach made a quiet argument for having said nothing, and then Esther said, "When is the end of the school year?" "June," he said, "I believe." "I would need to find a replacement teacher," she said, "or stay through the following year to give them time to find one." "That is fair," Patrick said. "If I stayed through a second year," she said slowly, thinking out loud, "that would be December 1884. Which is almost 2 years from now." "Yes," he said, "you are willing to wait 2 years." "I have been waiting 6 years for a direction to wait in," Patrick said. "2 more is manageable." She was quiet again. Then she said, "Yes, Patrick, I will marry you. In December 1884 or June 1884, whichever the school situation allows, I will come back here and marry you." He reached across and took her hand where it rested on the arm of her chair, and she turned her hand and held his back, and they sat like that in the dark and cold with the stars enormous overhead, and the ranch quiet around them, and Patrick felt something that was so large and so unfamiliar after so many years that it took him a moment to identify it correctly. He was happy, straightforwardly and without reservation happy. She left the next morning on the stage south to Taos, continuing her visit to her aunt, and Patrick rode into Seco Flats with her again to see her off, and this time when she stepped up into the stage she turned and he was there, and she held his face in both hands and kissed him properly, fully, with the whole morning watching. And then she said, "Write to me," and he said, "Every week." And the stage went south, and Patrick stood in the street of Seco Flats in the January cold and grinned like a man who has forgotten for a moment to be self-possessed. The letters continued, thicker now, more frequent. Patrick wrote every Sunday evening and sometimes on Wednesdays too, and Esther wrote back with the rhythm of the school year in them, the arc of the student's progress, the winter deepening over the mountains, the spring beginning in the high valleys. In March she wrote about Miguel, the boy who could not read in October, presenting a written report on migratory birds to the class, and standing at the front with his book and his notes with the air of someone who has discovered that they are not who they were told they were. And Patrick read that, and had to put the letter down and look at the ceiling for a moment. In March also, the Cree situation came to a resolution of sorts. Harlan Cree, apparently finding that Sheriff Assad Trent's formal visit and the county land office's documentation made further wire cutting inadvisable, made an offer through a lawyer to buy the Maddox parcel at what the lawyer described as a generous price. Patrick wrote to Esther about it, and Esther wrote back immediately with the clearest and most organized analysis of why he should not sell, what the land was worth in comparison to the offer, what selling would mean for his position in the county, and what she suspected Cree's actual plan for the land was, which she believed had to do with a rumored railway survey she had read about in a Santa Fe newspaper. Patrick wrote back that he had reached the same conclusions by a shorter route and had declined the offer, and that hearing her analysis was like having someone read his own thoughts back to him in better order. She wrote, "That is because we think alike on matters of substance. I suspect we knew that by the third letter." He wrote back, "I knew it earlier than that." She wrote, "When?" He wrote, "The Ridge in October." She wrote nothing for a moment, which was funny in a letter, and then, "Me too." The summer came and the second year of school began, and Esther found through careful correspondence with the Territory's Education Office a young woman from Albuquerque, a recent graduate of the normal school there, who was willing to take the Tierra Amarilla position beginning in January of 1885. This meant Esther could leave at the end of the fall term, which would be mid-December of 1884, and Patrick received that letter in August of 1883 and spent the next 16 months in the state of a man with a clear destination moving steadily toward it. The ranch improved. Patrick put the additional work in that came from having something to improve for, hired Domingo on 5 days a week instead of 3, built a second room onto the back of the house, because a single man's house was one thing, and a house for 2 people who intended to live well in it was another. He finished the new room in the late spring of 1884, and then stood in it, in the smell of fresh-cut lumber and new plaster, and thought about Esther Fletcher walking into this room for the first time, and the thought was so full that he had to go outside and stand in the yard and breathe for a minute. He rode to Seco Flats in April of 1884 and went to see the circuit judge who came through every 6 weeks, a sharp-eyed older man named Clarence Halst, and asked about the procedure for getting a marriage license in the Territory. And Judge Halst looked at him over his glasses with an expression of mild interest and said, "Maddox, I have been coming through this county for 4 years, and you are the last man I expected to be asking me this question." And Patrick said, "Circumstances change." And Judge Halst said, "They certainly do, son," and told him what he needed to know. In October of 1884, Esther wrote to say that the replacement teacher was settled, and the handover was proceeding, and that she was planning to travel south on the 15th of December if the weather held, and that she had already written to her aunt in Taos about the circumstances, and her aunt had cried, which Esther reported with both affection and slight exasperation. She also said that she had told Miguel and a handful of her older students that she was leaving to be married, and that Miguel, who was now 14 and reading at the level of a man twice his age, had said in his formal, careful way that the man she was marrying was lucky, and that Esther had agreed with him and told him to keep reading and write to her sometimes. Patrick read that letter in the last week of October, standing in the new room where the plaster had dried white, and the single window faced east toward the morning light, and he folded the letter and put it in his chest pocket with the careful tenderness of a man who understands that some pieces of paper are worth more than the ranch itself. December came in cold and clear. Patrick spent the first 2 weeks of it in a state of focused activity that Domingo observed with evident amusement and said nothing about, which Patrick appreciated. The house was fully prepared, the stove drawing well, the new room furnished with a decent bed and a chest of drawers that Patrick had bought in Seco Flats and brought out on a borrowed cart, a mirror on the wall and curtains on the window that he had bought from the dry goods store with the assistance of a very patient woman named Mrs. Arroyo, who had looked at him holding 2 different bolts of fabric and said, "The blue," and he had bought the blue. On the morning of December 15th, Patrick rode into Seco Flats. The sky was clear and cold, and the mountains were brilliant with snow, and the road was dry and good, and the stage from the north came in at 10:30, right on time, and the door opened and Esther Fletcher stepped down onto the street of Seco Flats with her carpet bag, and a second bag that had not existed in January of the previous year. And she looked at Patrick standing by his horse in the winter sunlight, and she walked to him and he walked to her, and she stopped in front of him and looked up at his face with those steady, warm, honest eyes. "I am here," she said. "You are here," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady. She put her hand against his cheek, the same gesture as January but reversed, and he turned his face slightly into her palm, and she said, "Hello, Patrick," and he said, "Hello, Esther," and then he pulled her into his arms and held her there in the middle of the street of Seco Flats, and she put her arms around him and held back, and the cold air was bright around them, and neither of them moved for a long moment. They were married 3 days later on December 18th, 1884. Judge Halst had been through the week before and would not be back for another month, so they were married by the county clerk, a matter-of-fact man named Abner Wells, who had performed the ceremony several times before, and did so with a dignified efficiency that Patrick appreciated. Domingo was present, standing by the office door in a clean shirt, and Esther had sent a letter to her aunt in Taos, and her aunt had sent a letter back full of happiness and regret at the distance, and the Seco Flats postmistress, Mrs. Arroyo, who had sold Patrick the blue curtains, came by because she had heard, and because she was the kind of woman who considered the community's happiness her personal business. Esther wore a dress that was not white but was a deep slate blue that made her eyes look darker, and she stood beside Patrick in the county clerk's office, and when Abner Wells asked her if she took this man, she looked at Patrick and said, "I do," with the same direct certainty she brought to everything, and Patrick said, "I do," and felt every word of it, and Wells said they were married, and Domingo led a cheer that Mrs. Arroyo joined with vigor. They rode back to the ranch in the cold afternoon light, side by side on their horses, the bay and the mare, and the mountains were pink with the last of the sun by the time they turned into the yard, and Patrick unsaddled the horses while Esther stood at the door of the house and looked at it the way you look at something you are about to enter for the first time as a different version of yourself. He came up behind her and she turned. "Will you open the door?" she said. He understood immediately what she was asking. He stepped past her and put his hand on the latch, the same latch he had stood at 2 years and 2 months ago with his hand hovering and the knock fresh in the air, and he opened it wide and held it and said, "Welcome home, Esther." She walked into her home. The months that followed were a period of such steady happiness that Patrick sometimes stopped in the middle of a day's work and was quietly astonished by the ordinariness of it, the way happiness, when it was real and established, was not a constant peak but a temperature, a thing the air of your life was made of. They worked the ranch together in the way that genuine partners do, not identically but with their efforts interlocking, Esther managing the accounts and correspondence with a precision that immediately improved the operations relationship with the bank and the suppliers, and Patrick managing the land and the cattle and the fence lines with the same attention he had always brought, and now brought with the added quality of someone who has a reason to come in from the field at the end of the day. Esther planted a kitchen garden in the spring of 1885, which was a project that took considerable negotiation with the hard-baked soil of the yard on the south side of the house, where the sun was good. And she wrestled it into productivity by July, and there were tomatoes and beans and peppers and herbs growing in the New Mexico sun, and she stood in the garden with her hands full of dirt and looked at it with satisfaction, and Patrick leaned on the fence rail and looked at her with an expression that he had stopped trying to moderate. She caught him looking and smiled. "What? I am thinking," he said, "that this is the best thing that has ever happened to this yard." "The garden," she said. "You," he said, "but also the garden." In the summer of 1885, Esther received a letter from Miguel, who was now 15 and living in Santa Fe with an uncle who had offered him work, but also connection to a school there, that an organization was funding specifically for Native and mixed heritage students. He was reading extensively, he reported, and had decided that he wanted to become a surveyor, which required mathematics that he was learning. He wanted to thank Mrs. Maddox for telling him that knowledge was a door, and that no one could close it once you had it open. Esther read the letter at the kitchen table, and Patrick watched her read it, and saw the way her face moved through several things, and settled on something that was equal parts joy and sorrow, the particular emotion of a teacher watching a student move beyond the range of their influence and into their own life. "He is going to be extraordinary," she said. "He already is," Patrick said. She folded the letter carefully and kept it in the same place Patrick kept hers, which was the inside cover of the book on the shelf, the one he had been holding without reading the first night she sat across from him, and the lamp made shadows on the wall. Their first child arrived in March of 1886, a boy, born in the bedroom of the ranch house with a midwife from Seco Flats in attendance and Domingo waiting in the yard in the cold pre-dawn, and Patrick at Esther's side doing whatever she told him to do with the focused obedience of a man who understood perfectly well, who was actually running this particular situation. The boy came into the world at 4 in the morning on a Saturday with the sound of the wind in the cottonwood outside the window and the lamplight warm on the ceiling, and Patrick held him, this small, improbable, absolute person, and looked at Esther where she lay exhausted and present in equal measure, and he said, "He is perfect," and she said, "He is extremely loud," which was true, and he laughed, which startled the baby into a momentary silence, which made Esther laugh too. They named him James after Patrick's father, with Thomas as a middle name after Esther's. James Maddox grew up on the ranch with the particular confidence of a child who is loved completely and told the truth, who learns to ride before he is fully comfortable walking, but who also learns to read early because his mother is a teacher and treats books as primary necessities, who helps with the cattle by the time he is 5, and who has, by the age of 6, developed a friendship with the son of Domingo that is the first and most enduring friendship of his life. In the autumn of 1887, Esther, having spent 2 years at the ranch as a rancher's wife, and finding this profoundly satisfying in most respects, but experiencing a specific absence in one, talked to Patrick about the school situation in Seco Flats, which had a schoolroom that was used only intermittently depending on whether a teacher could be found, and which had 12 school-age children in the town alone, without counting the outlying ranches. Patrick said that this seemed like a significant gap, and what did she think should be done about it? And Esther said she thought it should be done about by having a school with a consistent teacher, and Patrick said, "You are thinking about doing this," and she said, "I am thinking about doing this," and he said, "The ranch is in good order. Domingo is reliable. James can come with you or stay with me depending on the day," and she said, "You are certain?" And he said, "Esther, the best decision I ever made was opening that door. The second best is going to be watching you open a school." She opened the school in the spring of 1888, teaching in Seco Flats 3 days a week, riding in and back, and the 12 children became 22 within the first term as word spread to the outlying ranches and farms that there was a real school with a real teacher and consistent hours. And Esther taught them with the same method she had always used, treating knowledge as something already present in the student rather than something to be installed. And the school became the sort of institution that a town grows around. Patrick rode into Seco Flats sometimes to collect her at the end of a school day, tying the horses outside while he had a word with Mrs. Arroyo at the post office or a supply discussion with the dry goods proprietor. And when Esther came out of the school building with chalk dust on her hands and that particular light in her face that she had after a good day with the students, he would be leaning against the post outside waiting, and she would see him and say, "You came," and he would say, "I was in the area." Even though he was never in the area, he always came specifically. And she knew it and he knew, she knew it, and this was a small private joke that cost them nothing and gave them both something. The Cree situation resolved itself definitively in the fall of 1888 when Harlan Cree, apparently finding that his various legal and extralegal attempts to acquire the Maddox parcel had all encountered either the law, a Sad Trent Sheriff's Department, or Patrick's polite and immovable refusals, sold his own operation to an Eastern company and moved to El Paso, which was far enough away that it ceased to be a practical concern. Patrick heard this news from Domingo and told Esther over supper, and she said, "Good riddance to slow water," and Patrick raised his coffee cup in agreement. The railway survey that Esther had hypothesized in her 1883 letter turned out to be real, and the spur line came through Seco Flats in 1889, which connected the area to the larger network and changed the nature of the town and of the ranching operation. Patrick spent considerable thought on how to position the ranch's cattle operation in relation to the improved transport, and Esther contributed to these discussions with the same organized practicality she brought to everything, and the decisions they made in that period were ones that kept the Maddox Ranch in a position of stability while several neighboring operations struggled with the changes. Their second child, a daughter, arrived in the summer of 1889, and they named her Clara, which Patrick had suggested quietly on a morning in March when Esther was large and slow and sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, and he had said the name carefully and watched Esther's face, and she had looked at him with that open, reading expression and said, "Yes, if you want," and he had said, "I want to carry it forward, not to mourn," and she had said, "I know that. I know you. Yes, Clara." Clara Maddox was, from the first weeks of her life, a child of considerable and specific personality. She was quieter than James had been as an infant, but watchful in a way that made Patrick think she was paying attention to things that other people were missing. And by the time she was 2, she had a habit of bringing him objects, a stone, a feather, a piece of particularly interesting bark, and presenting them with a solemn gravity that made him treat each one as the gift it was intended to be. He kept a small shelf in the main room for the things Clara brought him, and the shelf grew. In the spring of 1890, Miguel wrote again. He was 20 years old and had become, as predicted, a surveyor, working for a company that was doing land surveys for the territory government, and he was good at it. He wrote with no false modesty, and he was paid fairly, which was not always a guarantee for someone of his background in the territory, and he knew it, and he had a woman he was going to marry in the summer. He wanted Mrs. Maddox to know that every day he used the mathematics she had made him love, the clean logic of measured distances and angles, the way the world could be understood precisely if you were patient enough to learn its language, and that he thought of her classroom and the book of natural history often. Esther wrote back immediately, filling 3 pages with warmth and questions and congratulations, and ended with, "You have done this yourself, Miguel. I only opened the door, you walked through." Patrick, reading this over her shoulder as she wrote it, said quietly, "That is what you do. That is what you have always done." She turned and looked at him, the pen still in her hand. "What? Open doors," he said. "You opened mine." She held his gaze for a moment with that full, steady look that still, after 6 years of marriage and 2 children, and every ordinary and extraordinary day of their shared life, landed in the center of his chest with the same clarity as the first time. "You opened it yourself," she said. "You knocked," he said. She smiled. "I suppose we can share the credit." James Maddox, at age 6 in 1892, began coming to the Seco Flats school 3 days a week with his mother, which was logistically simple and educationally efficient, though his mother held him to a standard somewhat above his peers because she knew what he was capable of and was not going to pretend otherwise. And James met this with the amiable tolerance of a child who has been raised to understand that things worth having require effort. He was good with numbers and better with horses and possessed of a storytelling ability that he deployed primarily on the younger students and on his sister Clara, who at 3 was his most devoted audience. Clara started school 2 years later, at the appropriate age, and sat in the front row with a focus that her mother recognized as her own and that Patrick recognized as something slightly fiercer. And within 3 weeks, she had corrected a factual error in a geography lesson, not because she was disruptive, but because she had read the relevant passage in the book at home the night before, and she was not the kind of person who could let an inaccuracy sit unremarked. And Esther looked at her daughter and thought, well, this is going to be extraordinary and also occasionally challenging, and loved her completely. The years continued with the quality that good years have, not without difficulty, because there was always difficulty. A bad winter for the cattle in 1891, a dry summer in 1893 that stressed the pastures and required Patrick to make hard decisions about the herd size. A fever that took James to his bed for 2 weeks in early 1892 and gave Patrick a 10-day reminder of everything he feared most that resolved when the boy's temperature broke, and he asked for food with the cheerful practicality of the young who have not yet understood what their recovery has cost the people watching over them. But the difficult things did not define the years. The years were defined by the kitchen table and the 2 horses and the south pasture in every season, and the school and the shelf of things Clara brought, and the letters from Miguel, and the regular visits from Esther's aunt from Taos, a brisk and funny woman named Agnes who made Patrick feel slightly evaluated on every visit, and who he had come to understand showed approval through brisk challenge, and who had been telling him for years that he had better be good to her niece, and whom he answered each time that he was trying his best, and who said once, more than halfway through the 1890s, sitting on the porch after supper with a glass of the good whiskey, he broke out for her visits, "You are doing more than trying, Maddox. You are managing it, which is a different and better thing." In the fall of 1893, Patrick rode the south fence line, a thing he still did regularly, and stopped at the place where the wire had been cut 3 times in the autumn of 1882, the place where he and Esther had stopped, and she had told him to file his complaint with the land office, the place where she had said that Cree was counting on other people's reluctance to engage with the law. He sat his horse there in the October light, 11 years on, and looked at the fence that was solid and had been solid for years, and looked west where the Cree operation had become an Eastern Company's cattle enterprise managed by a man from back east who was perfectly civil and had no designs on anyone else's land, and looked south toward the ridge where the pasture lay, and thought about a knock on a door in October 1882 and everything that had been on the other side of it. He rode back to the house and came into the kitchen, and Esther was at the table with Clara beside her, the 2 of them working through an arithmetic problem that Clara had evidently decided required a parent as collaborator, and James was on the floor by the stove with one of his books and a piece of cord he was tying into knots of increasing complexity. The kitchen smelled of the supper already started on the stove, onions and pepper and the good smell of beans, and the lamp on the table made the warm amber light that the room always had in the evenings, and Patrick stood in the doorway and looked at all of this. Esther looked up and saw his face. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Everything." She studied him for a moment with that reading look, and then she smiled, the real and full smile that he had first heard as a laugh on the ridge in October 1882, and had been the sound of his world writing itself. "Come and sit," she said. "Clara has found a way to make 11 times 12 into a philosophical question." Clara looked up at her father with an expression that suggested she found the suggestion that arithmetic could be anything other than philosophical somewhat provincial. And James looked up from his knots briefly to confirm that this was funny, and then looked back down. And Patrick came in and hung his hat on the hook by the door and sat down at the table in his chair, the one that had always been his, and was now his in the deeper sense of belonging to a life that was his in every way that mattered. He looked at Esther across the table. She had chalk dust on her left hand from the school, and a small smear of flour on her jaw that she had apparently got from the bread she had started before coming to help with the arithmetic. And her hair had done what it always eventually did by the end of a day, escaped its pins in 2 or 3 places. And she was not young in the way she had been young when she stood on his porch with the road dust on her hem. But she was luminous in a way that had nothing to do with youth and everything to do with a life being fully lived. And Patrick looked at her and felt the thing in his chest that had been called happiness, and was called that still, but which had deepened over the years into something quieter and more total, something that was the temperature of the air in this room and the look on her face and the sound of James's cord finding a new knot in Clara's pen moving across her arithmetic slate. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand and held it. Clara, without looking up from her arithmetic, said, "Papa, do you know what 11 times 12 is?" 132, Patrick said. "Yes," Clara said in the tone of someone confirming a hypothesis rather than learning a fact. "But why?" "Clara," Esther said with great patience and suppressed amusement, "the why is what we are working on." "I know," Clara said. "I just wanted to make sure he knew the what. You can't know the why without the what." James made a small sound from the floor that was the sound of someone agreeing. Patrick looked at his daughter and then at his son and then at his wife, and outside the cottonwood moved in the evening wind, the same cottonwood that had been there on the night of the knock, bigger now and more settled into the yard, rooted the way things root when they are left in peace long enough to become essential. "Fair enough," he said. The ranch had grown to a steady and well-regarded operation by the middle of the decade. The spur line continued to serve the area, and Patrick's cattle operation, restructured twice on Esther's good advice, was returning reliably. The Seco Flats School under Esther had become a genuine institution, and in 1895 the county formally recognized it and provided modest but real funding, which allowed Esther to hire a second teacher for the younger grades, a young woman named Rosa who was from a family in Seco Flats and who had been one of Esther's first students when the school opened, and who now sat beside her former teacher at the head of the same room, which Esther found so deeply satisfying that she made Patrick come and look at the classroom one evening, just so she could stand in it and feel the circularity of it properly. He stood in the empty schoolroom with the small desks in their rows and the books on the shelf, and the map on the wall that Esther had bought with her own money in 1888, and he looked at her standing there in the last light through the single window, and he thought about a woman who had said on the first night in his kitchen that a good teacher treats knowledge as though it were the most valuable thing in the world, and gives it away freely. And he thought about everything she had given away since and everything that had grown from it. "Are you proud?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Is that allowed?" "It is more than allowed," he said. "It is accurate," she laughed, and the room was full of it. In the Christmas of 1895, James was 9 and Clara was 6, and they had a third child on the way, Esther being in her 5th month with the steady good health that had characterized both previous pregnancies. And Agnes came down from Taos for the holiday, and the house was full in a way that it had not been since the ranch house was a single-man spare and silent rooms, full of voices and warmth, and the specific pleasant chaos of a family in a good house at the best time of year. Agnes cornered Patrick in the kitchen on Christmas Eve while Esther was putting the children down and said, with her characteristic directness, "You know what you have, don't you, Maddox?" Patrick poured her a glass of the good whiskey because that was what Christmas Eve called for and said, "I know what I have." "Good," Agnes said, accepting the glass. "Because most people don't know until it's gone. That's the tragedy of most things." She took a sip. "You're one of the lucky few who figured it out while it was still there to be known." "I was taught that," Patrick said, "by a woman who knocked on my door." Agnes looked at him over her glass with the expression she always had, the testing, measuring look that had made him feel evaluated for years, and she said, "She told me once that the thing she was most sure about was you. And she is not a woman who is sure about things carelessly." "No," he said, "she is not." Esther came back into the kitchen then, and she looked from her husband to her aunt and said, "What are you two talking about?" And Agnes said, "You," and Esther said, "I see." And Patrick handed her a cup of warm apple cider because she had given up the good whiskey for the duration, and she accepted it, and settled at the kitchen table beside her aunt. And the two of them fell into conversation while Patrick stood at the stove, and listened to his wife and her aunt talk with the easy familiarity of two women who have known each other long enough to need very few words for the important things. Their third child arrived in April of 1896, a boy, strong and loud from the first minute, and they named him Henry, which was the name of Patrick's grandfather, a man who had been a farmer in Kentucky, and who Patrick had known only briefly as a small child, but who he remembered with a fondness that had always felt larger than the actual memories warranted, as though the man had put something in him that went beyond what their short acquaintance should have allowed. Henry Maddox grew to resemble his father in build and his mother in disposition, which was in Patrick's view an ideal combination, being substantial and practical, and also fully engaged with the world and curious about everything in it. James, at 11, took the arrival of a second brother with the settled generosity of an oldest child who had always been secure enough to share. And Clara, at 7, regarded Henry with the focused interest of a scientist noting a new variable, which evolved over the following months into a fierce protectiveness that endured their entire lives. The ranch in the summer of 1896 was a full and working place, the hay in the south pasture cut and stacked, the cattle fat on the good grass that the spring rains had produced, the kitchen garden producing abundantly, the blue curtains in the new room that was not new anymore but was the heart of the house, Esther's and Patrick's room, where the morning light came through the east window, and they lay in the early hours sometimes before the children were up, and talked in the way that people talk when they have been married long enough to have no pretense left, but enough to still find each other interesting, which is the most reliable indicator of a good marriage that Patrick knew. "I think about that night sometimes," Esther said one morning in July of 1896, lying in the early light with Henry asleep in the cradle nearby, and the sound of James and Clara already audible from the yard, because those two were always up before anything reasonable. "Which night?" Patrick said, though he knew. "October 1882, she said. "The stage with the broken axle." I was so tired and so cross about it, and the man at the trading post in Seco Flats had this expression when he told me about you, like he was warning me off, like you were some kind of territorial bear in a house. "I was somewhat bearish," Patrick said. "You were afraid," Esther said, not unkindly but plainly. "Yes," he said, "and you opened the door anyway." "You knocked," he said. "I have told you this before. I was moving before I decided to." She turned her head to look at him. "I think that is the bravest thing you ever did. Braver than the fence lines, braver than Cree. Considerably," she said. "Cree you could manage with paper and a sheriff. The door was the thing that could have hurt you." Patrick looked at the ceiling and the morning light making its slow way across it. "It was a very good decision," he said. "I agree," she said. Henry made a small sound from the cradle. the preparatory sound of a baby about to decide that sleep was no longer interesting. And Esther turned to look at him with the reflexive attention of a mother. And Patrick looked at the side of her face in the morning light and thought about a knock on a door in October of 1882, and a woman with road dust on her hem and a carpetbag and those eyes, those steady, honest eyes. And the way he had been on his feet and crossing the room before the decision had caught up with the movement. The way something in him had known even before the knowing part of him had caught up. He had not opened his door to a guest in 6 years, and then she knocked, and he had moved before he decided to, and everything that was this house and this morning and these children and this life had come through that door with her. All of it. Every year and every letter and every conversation on the porch and every ride to the south pasture and every lamplit evening and every true thing said. All of it coming from the moment when she knocked and he was already moving. Henry made his decisive announcement to the morning, and Esther lifted him from the cradle and Patrick sat up, and the day began the way their days always began, with noise and light, and the very full, ordinary miracle of a life that had grown from one brave, unreasoned movement toward an open door. The years that followed continued in the direction that good years go. The Maddox Ranch became one of the stable, respected operations of the county. Esther's school graduated student after student into lives that were larger for what they had learned there. James grew into a young man of considerable competence and genuine kindness, who at 17 already had a clear idea of what he wanted from the land and the life he had grown up in. Clara grew into a young woman of such focused intelligence and such complete refusal to be told what she could, and could not know that Patrick could only look at her and feel a pride so large it was almost uncomfortable, the pride of recognizing someone. Henry, the youngest, became the one who kept them all laughing, not because he was careless, but because he had a gift for finding the thing in a situation that was funny without being cruel about it. And the dinner table, when all 3 children were present, was the loudest and best thing that happened in that house regularly. Patrick Maddox stood at the door of his house on a morning in the fall of 1899 and looked out at the ranch. The cottonwood was enormous now, a full and settled tree, and the south pasture was red gold in the October light that he had first tried to describe to a woman in a letter 17 years ago. And from the barn he could hear James talking to the horses in the low, steady voice that horses trusted. And from the kitchen behind him, he could hear Esther and Clara in argument about something that was, from the fragments he could catch, simultaneously about geography and about whose turn it was to do what. And Henry, 8 years old and currently in the yard somewhere, was narrating something to himself in the imaginative half-voice of a child deep in the middle of a story that was entirely his own. The land was gold and the sky was hard blue, and the mountains were showing the first white on their high places, and the air had the particular bite that October brought here, sharp and clean, and full of the smell of the grass. Esther came and stood beside him in the doorway. She had brought him a cup of coffee without his asking, which she did sometimes, and she stood beside him and looked out at the morning and did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Clara says Rio Bravo empties into the Gulf of Mexico and not the Gulf of California, and she is right, but she said it as though I didn't know, and I am a schoolteacher." "You are the schoolteacher who told her that," Patrick said. "That is exactly the problem," Esther said. Patrick smiled and took his coffee. They stood together in the doorway of their house with the October morning before them and the children behind them, and the land running gold to the mountains and the cottonwood moving in the easy morning wind. And Patrick thought that this was what he had not known he was waiting for in all those 6 quiet years, not simply the end of grief, but this specific thing, the warmth of another person standing beside you in your own doorway. The knowledge that the door was open and had been open and would stay open. The world coming in and going out freely, the house full of everything that a house should be full of. She had knocked on a closed door in October of 1882 and he had moved before he decided to, and the decision, when it finally caught up, had been the best one of his life. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood in the doorway of their home and watched the morning happen. And it was exactly enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.